This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you, Anu. So the last 2 years, I've been working on this project for my master's thesis with the Cornell Small Farms program. So my research has been on using black plastic tarps on the surface of the soil prior to planting to suppress weeds and make reduced tillage more viable in organic vegetable systems. To outline this project, I'm going to first start out with a bit of background. So how is plastic already used in vegetable systems? Kind of get into what organic vegetable systems are, what they entail, and then how does tillage fit into this, and why should we reduce it? Then I'll get into what is a tarp, why, when, how do you use a tarp, and what questions was I trying to answer with this research. I'll then get into the data and the results of the experiment, looking first at how tarps impact the soil environment, and then how tarps impact weeds and crop yield. There's time at the end, I'll get into some of the farm trials that I've been working on. So I had 4 on-farm trials at some local farms within the region that actually implemented this project onto their farms. But first, to start with a bit of background. So plastic in agriculture is not a new thing. Farmers use plastic in a variety of different ways on their farms. Solarization and plastic mulch film are the 2 ways that are most similar to tarps, so I'm going to be getting into those in more detail in the next couple of slides. Tarps can also be used for fumigation, so that's putting tarps on the surface of the soil and injecting a gas, such as methyl bromide or other things like that, that will kill all pathogens under the tarp. Plastic is also used as row covers, which is put over crops and protects them from insects. Or they can be used in low tunnels, such as on the bottom, or high tunnels, like on the top, to increase temperatures and extend the growing season on a farm. Plastic can even be used as a covering for heated greenhouses. So let's look a bit more closely at solarization. Solarization is the use of clear plastic polyethylene on the surface of the soil in times of high heat and high sunlight. This concentrates the heat in the sunlight and kills weeds and weed seeds under the tarps. If it's hot enough, it can even kill pathogens or nematodes under it as well. But if you look at where this is done, so Jordan, Italy, Pakistan, Syria, Turkey, and the warmer states of the United States, you need extreme temperatures to make this work. If you look here at the average temperatures under these solarization tarps, they range from 100 degrees Fahrenheit up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So first of all, this has to be done in the summer, which can interfere with cropping plans. And second of all, if these temperatures don't reach high enough temperatures, that can actually promote weed growth. So if you use solarization in a place like the Northeast, you may actually promote weeds by creating a sort of mini greenhouse on the surface of the soil. You increase heat, you increase moisture, and the weeds still have sunlight. So this is not really a viable practice in the Northeast. Black plastic mulch is extremely common in the Northeast. It's a very thin polyethylene plastic, about 1 to 2 mil, and you have to have specialized equipment to do this. You use a bed former, which stretches this plastic mulch over your beds and buries the edges. And you actually plant crops into this, as you can see here. So this plastic mulch stays on the surface of the soil throughout the entire growing season. It suppresses weeds, it increases temperature, and it preserves moisture. Farmers will typically put drip tape underneath this to irrigate their crops. So as you can see here, there is no in-between row control of weeds for this system, and this is very thin, so it is not reusable. It will degrade, it will tear throughout the course of the season, and you actually have to pull this up and get rid of it at the end of the growing season. So why would you use these sort of strange methods with plastic in agriculture? And how does this relate to tillage? Well, first, let's look at organic systems. So if you've lived in Ithaca for any period of time, you've seen the success and the growth of organics in consumer, like farmers markets and grocery stores, things like that. So the number of small farms, small organic farms in the Northeast that grow diversified vegetables is growing rapidly. And these farms have a lot of unique challenges. And probably the biggest challenge that these organic farmers face is weed control. These organic farmers cannot use pesticides. So instead they have to use cultural control practices to get rid of weeds. These can include crop rotation, flame weeding, cover crops, plastic, as we've seen, but most of all tillage. So these farmers heavily rely on intensive tillage to control weeds in their systems. Tillage especially is effective at controlling weeds that have already emerged, and is one of the only ways that these farmers can get rid of emerged weeds without using an herbicide. So tillage controls weeds. It incorporates residue from past cover crops or the crop that was in the season before, and it creates a smooth planting bed in which the farmers can plant. But intensive tillage degrades soil health. Tillage weakens soil structure, it breaks up aggregates, it can form surface sealing, it causes compaction, increases erosion, and causes moisture loss from the soil. Tillage also increases aeration and warming of the soil, which increases microbial activity, and that can cause an increase in the oxidation of carbon. This does two things. First of all, this will put CO2 into the atmosphere, which is bad for climate change. Also, this will decrease the organic matter content of the soil. Looking at it from more of a farmer perspective, tillage costs labor, time, and fuel. So can plastic help with this? If we look back at solarization, yes, solarization does help control weeds, which could in turn help farmers reduce tillage. However, we saw that solarization does not work on farms in the Northeast. Plastic mulch actually requires tillage. So in order to make these beds, you have to till. So while it does decrease weeds, it does not decrease tillage. So there's a gap here. How can we use plastic to decrease tillage on organic vegetable farms in the Northeast? Enter tarps. So what is a tarp? You've all heard of tarps, I'm sure. They cover your baseball fields, they protect your equipment from rainfall, and they can even be used in innovative ways, such as making a sail for a sailboat, a hammock, or 25 different survivalist shelters. But for our purposes, a tarp is a sheet of plastic, 6 mil, black polyethylene. So this plastic has been treated to be UV resistant. It is black on at least one side, and it is impermeable to water and air. So these are a lot thicker than plastic mulch, which means they're a lot more durable, and they can last multiple seasons. They're cut to cover multiple crop beds, and that includes in between rows. So tarps go on the ground a number of weeks or even months prior to planting of cash crops, and then the farmer removes this tarp before planting their crops. So these are some pictures just showing what a tarp looks like in an actual vegetable production system. Let's get into some logistics of tarps. So tarps range in price from around $100 to $290. This depends on the size of the tarp. Tarps are typically 100 feet long, and 100 feet is pretty much the standard bed length in a small-scale vegetable farm. So that's why they're that length, and then they can range from 24 to 50 feet wide, depending on how many beds you want to cover. But the wider the tarp is, the heavier it gets, of course, and they can be 75 pounds or even more when you get up to those really wide tarps. So a lot of the farmers that we've been working with will actually cut these tarps down to smaller size to make them more manageable, because a gigantic piece of 75-pound plastic on a windy day is quite unruly. They become giant sails. So management can be an issue, but farmers are finding ways around this. Farmers lay these on the surface of the soil and hold them down using heavy objects. A lot of farmers use sandbags, rocks, concrete, or even just shovelfuls of soil. I have heard from some farmers that using the soil burying method doesn't work as well, and that the wind will rip the tarps up on a very windy day. So we suggest using the sandbags, rocks, and concrete. In order to store these tarps, a lot of farmers will actually roll these between beds and keep them there during the season and the winter. However, this does increase exposure of tarps to the environment. And so in order to get the most out of the reusability of these tarps, we suggest either storing them in a barn or a shed, or else if you want to leave them in the field, you should at least cover them with something else to keep the rain and the sunlight off of them. And the warranty on these is usually 5 years, but I've heard of farmers using them 10 years or even more if you're careful to maintain them. So the questions that I was looking at for tarps are already used pretty widely in the Northeast, but no research had been done on the mechanisms of how these tarps actually impact the soil, how they actually impact weeds, or if they really do increase yield of crops. So the questions I sought to seek with this research was, how do tarp benefits relate to tarp duration? So is a 3-week tarp versus a 6-week tarp or longer, does that have a difference in the effect it has on soil, weeds, and crops? Do tarp benefits differ with planting date? So if you put a tarp down in May versus June versus July, does that have a difference in the impact of these tarps? How do tarps impact the soil environment and weeds? And can tarps actually help reduce tillage through these mechanisms? So to answer these questions, we designed this experiment. I'm first going to show you a bit of a time layout just to kind of get in your head, because it can be kind of confusing with the tarp durations. So we had 2 planting dates. One is on top and one is on bottom. We planted an oat cover crop in August, and then we flail mowed this in November. Now for the early planting, we put down a 24-week tarp directly on top of that flail mowed oat cover crop. And then if you skip down to when we actually planted, each tarp duration is the number of weeks before planting. So here we have the 3-week tarp was 3 weeks before planting, 6 weeks before planting, and 10 weeks before planting. So for our late planting, we actually had a 10-week cover crop because a 10-week tarp, because a 24-week tarp would have been in the middle of winter, and we can't put a tarp down on top of snow. So for our 10, we had that as a 10+ week duration. So for the early planting, that was 24 weeks. For the late planting, that was 10 weeks. We then removed the tarps, and a few days later, we then planted beets and harvested beets at the end of the season. So this is a picture on the top left of the oat cover crop that we mowed down. Then you can see we put the tarps directly on top of that. The picture on the bottom is showing tarps around March, April, so this shows more of the treatments, and the tarps later in the season. After we removed tarps, we applied 3 tillage treatments to see the interaction between tarps and tillage. We had a no-till, which was no disturbance of the soil except with the planter. We had a reduced till, which was a 1 to 3 inch shallow till, depending on the location. And then we had a conventional till, which was 4 to 8 inches with a rototill. We had this whole experiment in 3 locations. So one was in Freeville, about 20 minutes away, and that is where I've been conducting my personal research experiment. We also had the same experiment in Monmouth, Maine, and in Riverhead, Long Island, to see how tarps impact different climates, different soil types, things like that. So the actual depth of tillage did vary by location, so we put them in those groups. We then planted beets as an indicator crop. We chose beets for a variety of reasons. One is that table beets are growing in popularity in the Northeast. 2 is that they are a root crop, so they show the effects of soil compaction a lot more than other crops would. They're also sensitive to nitrogen and to weeds, which made them a good indicator crop. And they're delicious. So after the end of the season, we harvested the beets, we put them in different size classes, and we weighed them with fresh weight to estimate yield. So let's get into the data. First, I'm going to look at soil environment effects of tarps. And this is mainly from when the tarps went on the ground through to planting. So starting with soil temperature. Tarps were on the surface of the soil for a wide range of seasonality. And you can see here, we put them on in November when things were still green. They stayed through the snow and then came off in the spring. The temperatures at the time of tarp removal were about 1.5 to 10.4 degrees higher than bare ground. But was this effect only during warm seasons, or was it the entire duration?
Haley, how deep was that?
The temperature sensors were 15 centimeters, so about, 6 inches. So here's a sample graph from some Monmouth, Maine data. So here we have average soil temperature in Fahrenheit on the left. On the bottom, it's the various parts of the season that the tarps were actually on the soil. Left, we have planting 1, which was the early planting, and on the right, we have planting 2, which was the late planting. So I have these lines down here, and these by color and placement show when a tarp was applied. So before the light green 3-week tarp applied, for example, that tarp was not on the soil until that line. Beyond that, the light green indicates temperature under the tarp. And the black line on the bottom, the dotted line, that's the bare soil. So as you can see here, prior to around June, there was not much pattern with tarp temperature. But once you get to warmer temperatures, around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, tarps started to increase the temperature compared with bare soil. So what we can find from this is that in the cold seasons, tarps did not really impact temperature. But once it got warm outside, tarps did increase soil temperature from 1 to 10 degrees. And I have a table here showing this is 1 day before we remove the tarps. We have Freeville, Monmouth, and Riverhead, our 3 locations for each of the 2 years, and planting 1 and planting 2. We have no tarp, 3-week tarp, 6-week tarp, and 10 or more week tarp on the left. So in almost all the treatments except for 2, temperature did significantly increase under tarps. And I've bolded the widest difference between no tarp and tarp for each one. So you can see that as temperatures got warmer, that increase got higher. So here's the highest right here. This is the warmest temperatures it ever got under the tarps. We get a 10-degree increase when it gets warmer. Whereas when it's cooler, such as here with the 50s, it only increased by 3 degrees. So tarps do increase soil temperatures under the tarps, but it really doesn't have much of an effect until later in the season when it's warm outside. Soil moisture was not different between tarp durations. So a 3-week tarp, 6-week tarp, and 10-week tarp did not affect soil moisture differently, but tarp duration of any length did have higher soil moisture compared with bare ground. So first, I'm going to show the rainfall and temperature data of the entire 2 years that this experiment was in place. So the left side is precipitation in inches, and that's the blue lines. The right side is daily average temperature in Fahrenheit, and that's the red line. And then down here, I have each of the tarp durations. So this is the solid lines is when a tarp went down for planting 1. Dotted lines is when a tarp went down for planting 2. The longer lines is when a tarp was removed. So we don't need to get too much into this graph. I just want to demonstrate with this that there is really no pattern in terms of when we put a tarp down. Sometimes the tarps went down on an extremely rainy day. Sometimes the tarps went down when there was no rain. And yet by the end of the season, or the end of the tarp duration that is, there was a difference, a uniform difference in soil moisture based on tarps. So about 5 of the 10 different treatments we had across plantings and years did have increased moisture. And the most increase was in Monmouth, Maine by far. So here we can see that when it's drier, tarps increase the soil moisture by a lot more. When it's pretty even soil moisture, the tarps didn't really make much of a difference. So Riverhead did not have a significant difference, but Riverhead also has very sandy soils, which probably had a big impact on that. In the more clay, silty soils of Freeville and Monmouth, tarps did often significantly increase the moisture of the soil. We also have a lot of observations from farmers on this, and what they have found is that the tarps sort of even out the moisture underneath them, and so that when it's very dry outside, the moisture under the tarps is much greater. When it's very wet outside, so if you have an extremely heavy rainfall, heavy snow melt, waterlogging of the soil, it is not as waterlogged under the tarps. So they really just create a sort of ideal moisture environment in which to plant your crops. Soil nitrogen was significantly impacted by tarps. Nitrate concentrations increased with tarp duration, but ammonium concentrations did not. So let's look first at nitrate. Here we have a graph on the left showing nitrate in parts per million in the soil. This is also at 15 centimeters. And down here we have tarp duration in weeks from no tarp up to 10 or more weeks. Again, on the left we have planting 1, on the right we have planting 2. This is from Freeville, but every single site showed this exact same pattern. In the dark, in the black bars, we have pre-tarp nitrate. So this was the soil samples that were taken before we put the tarps down. The gray is showing the nitrate concentrations after the day that we took the tarps up. And you can see that when we put the tarps down, there was no difference across the plots in nitrate. When we put the tarps down, the longer a tarp was on, the more significantly increased nitrate concentrations became in the soil. So why did this happen? We have a few hypotheses. One is that nitrate concentrations increase due to prevention of leaching. Nitrate is an extremely soluble compound, and when, especially during the winter, when there are no crops in place to take up that nitrate, when there's snowmelt, when there's rainfall, that's very easily leached through the soil. These tarps prevent that leaching. It's also possible that that increase in moisture, that increase in temperature, increased microbial activity, and therefore nitrification. We have no evidence of this, but these are possible mechanisms that could have caused that spike in nitrate under the tarps. So looking into weed seeds, this is still within the soil environment because these are seeds that we actually buried under the tarps. So we wanted to see how tarps impacted the germination of weed seeds. So what we did is we took pigweed and lamb's quarters seeds, which are the two most common weed species that we encountered in this field, and we buried them in bags and then took them out at the end of the tarp duration and tested all the seeds for viability. So what we found from this is that tarps had no impact on lamb's quarters viability, but they actually slightly increased the viability of pigweed seeds. And so what viability means in this context is that fewer seeds either germinated or fewer seeds degraded under the tarps compared with the bare soil, which is not what we were expecting. One possible explanation for this is that the tarps created an environment that may have induced dormancy. The tarps may have protected these weed seeds from exposure to snow, air, and sunlight. We're not really sure. But I have found literature that found that pigweed seeds actually will increase in germination in the dark with an increase in temperature and nitrate, which we also had. So it could have also been a seasonality thing, but we did not find an increase in a decrease in viability under tarps. But if you look up at this picture, all of these little white strings, those are weed seedlings. And so in one treatment of our tarp, this was the early planting for Freeville, we found all this flush of white thread stage seedlings under the tarp. So this does show that to some extent, tarps do induce germination of seeds. And all of these seedlings were dead from exposure within 1 or 2 hours once they hit the sunlight and the air. So to some degree, tarps can create a sort of stale seedbed by increasing this germination. And when these seeds germinate and die under the tarps, that's fewer seeds that will germinate and live in your crop. Crop residue was something that we had a very different result from what we've heard. So there is at least one study showing that crops do degrade crop residue at an increased rate compared with bare ground. We've also heard from farmers that crop residue is degraded by tarps. We found quite the opposite. So percent cover of crop residue was not impacted by tarps. In fact, in some cases, it slightly increased, though not significantly. So here you can see a picture where the tarp was. It actually preserved that cover crop. Some hypotheses we have for this is that a lot of farmers will actually lightly till in the crop residue before tillage, or they will apply compost, watering, or amendments, which may spike an increase in the degradation, whereas we just put the tarps directly over the cover crop. Yes?
Do you measure crop residue?
We measured crop residue by percent cover. So we had a beaded string that we put across the plot, and each time a specific point on the string hit a piece of residue, we would count that and then calculate percent out of 100. So getting into weeds and crop yield. This is a picture at about 5 minutes after we've taken the tarps off. This is for planting 1. And this shows that tarp use of any duration decreased weed percent cover by 95 to 100%. So here we have no tarp, and then in the back and to the right, we have our different tarp treatments. There were no living weeds present under any of these treatments. There was 100% or nearly 100% control of weeds at the time of tarp removal. You can see the back here is very dark. That's just because of that overwinter residue that's still dark and green is what's making that color difference. So what happens after 10 days? Does this increase, or does this, go on throughout the season to have the same effect on the weeds? So in Freeville and Monmouth, planting 2 only, tarp treatments did have less weed biomass compared with bare soil. Weed counts were never affected. In Riverhead, however, both weed mass and weed counts were significantly reduced by tarps after 10 days. So I have some graphs here to show this. On the top, we have weed count, which is per meter squared for planting 1 on the left and planting 2 on the right. And there is really not much of a pattern here. So down here, we have our tillage treatments, none, reduced, and conventional. So tillage did decrease the counts of weeds, but tarps did not. But if you look on the bottom, this is biomass in grams per meter squared. And in planting 1, we didn't really have much of an impact still until you get to reduced and conventional. But planting 2, we did have a significant decrease in weed biomass from the tarps. So this may just be a seasonal variation. This may be because many of the weeds had already emerged for the planting 2. And so when we actually put the tarps down for planting 2, the shorter duration tarps were going down on already emerged weeds. And so that killed everything that was already there. This is a graph from Riverhead, however. So as you see here, this is also 10 days later, and there was still almost 100% control of weeds 10 days later, as opposed to in Freeville. So because of these contrasting results, we wanted to look at the weed species dynamics. So here I have the top 5 to 6 weed species for each site that we had. And I put a star by some of these because these are the ones that had some interesting dynamics. So first of all, pigweed was extremely prominent in Freeville and in Monmouth. And we actually found in some treatments that pigweed increased under tarps. This has also been found in studies with plastic mulch. Pigweed is a hoarder of nitrogen, so if you increase nitrate that much with tarps, especially with the added benefits of the temperature and the moisture, it's likely to increase in germination. Red clover also has a star by it because this, in Monmouth, they had a huge red clover population. It was entirely decimated by tarps. So tarps clearly have very species-specific effects. For example, in Freeville, common chickweed was by far the top species in terms of prevalence, but it was also very well controlled by tarps. So when using tarps on farms, you really have to know what species you have, and the tarp impact on your weed suppression will depend on what species you have on your farm. So when we started to look at the interaction between tarps and tillage, we found a very interesting interaction. So this graph is grams per meter squared of weed biomass in Monmouth, Maine. On the bottom here, we have tarp duration in 0 up to 10 or more weeks, and then tillage treatments by color. So with no tarp and no tillage, you had extremely high weed counts, as one would imagine. But the second you use a tarp, your weed counts decrease rapidly. Whereas if you look at the tarp treatments across the reduced tillage or the conventional tillage, there was very little difference. So what this shows is that by using tarps, you make weed suppression similar between conventional till no tarp and reduced or no till tarp. And to illustrate this further, I have a picture here. So this is the plots at the time of harvest. On this column, on the left column, we have no tarp. On the right column, we have 3-week tarp. And then each of these is shown for no-till, reduced till, and conventional till. So let's look first at the no tarp column. As you can see on the top where there's no till, we had no yield. That is all weeds. When you get to reduced till, we had a bit more of a yield. And when you get to conventional till, we had a full yield. But if you compare that to the column next to it with the 3-week tarp, all of those yields are pretty much the same. And these yields are also comparable to the conventional till yield. And each of the tarp treatments had this. The 3-week, 6-week, and 10-week had no effect on this. So 3 weeks was enough to create this effect. So what this means is, first of all, no tarp, no till is no yield. But if you use a tarp for 3 weeks or beyond, it does show an increased yield benefit. So that graph I showed you with the weed interaction was identical for yield interaction. So tarps did increase crop yield in the no-till and the reduced-till treatments, and they made them comparable to the conventional till treatments. So let's start looking into the farm trials. What I did here is I went to 4 farms. 3 of them were around the Finger Lakes, and 1 was actually in the Hudson Valley. So at each of these farms, I implemented a small version of my experiment where we worked with the farm for 2 beds that they had the same crop in. 1 bed they would manage as they would always manage it. The second bed they would manage with tarps. And the only other thing they had to do, or the only thing they had to do, was have the tarp on for at least 3 weeks. Other than that, they could leave it on as long as they wanted. They could put any tillage or other treatments they wanted. So the first farm I worked with was Centurion Farm. These farmers tarped for 3 to 4 weeks prior to planting an onion and a dry bean crop. And this was the farm that really found a difference in soil moisture. So these found that for the later season dry beans, the tarps were extremely effective. As you know, July this year was extremely dry. And so when they put in their crops that started in July, there was extremely better yield and stand counts because of that increased moisture under the tarps. They also found at this farm that using a tarp later in the season was more effective than early in the season because they planted very early onions. And so that means they took their tarps off in April, early April. And as we saw, a lot of the effects of tarps depend on seasonality and on the outside temperature. So they found the tarps a lot more helpful for their later season dry beans. The second farm was Muddy Fingers Farm, and for this farm, they tarped for 4 to 5 weeks prior to a beet crop. They also found an extreme help in the moisture in July because this beet crop did go in July. They had almost no stand count in July that was not tarped. When they tarped, the soil was moist and it increased their yields. Even when they irrigated the non-tarp beds, it just didn't hold that moisture, whereas the tarp beds did. They also experienced a very big increase in the degradation of their cover crop. So they used a sun hemp cover crop and found that by adding amendments on before the cropping, they significantly reduced their cover crop at the time of planting. The third farm was Plowbreak Farm. They used tarps for 5 to 6 weeks prior to a mixed green crop. So this farm found that when they applied tillage after their tarps, it pretty much negated most of the benefits. It brought up more weed seeds and actually increased a lot of their weed pressure. They especially had problems with perennials. But when they tilled before the tarps, it significantly increased their yields and decreased their weeds. So this is something that we would like to look more into, is if you're going to apply tillage or amendments, should you do that before tarping or after tarping? And what we found for most of the growers is they're actually doing it before tarping. As I said, this farm has a really big problem with perennials, especially quackgrass, and they found that tarps really did decrease their perennial populations. So that is another benefit of tarps that I haven't really touched on, is their benefit to perennials, because we didn't really have a lot of perennials in our systems. So what these tarps can do is they can actually decrease the carbohydrate reserves of these perennials underneath the tarps. And that's something that tillage doesn't do. So if you want to get rid of a perennial crop through tillage, you have to continuously till that until it degrades all of the carb reserves in those plants. But tarps probably for more than 3 weeks would be needed, but tarps can, if not kill a perennial crop, it can significantly reduce its viability. So we've had farmers that will have like a huge infestation of thistle, for example. And they find that after tarping for 3 or 4 weeks, the thistle is not dead, but it is blanched white, it is very weak, and they can pull it up by the taproot. Whereas if you tried that before, you can never get a thistle up by its taproot. And the last farm I worked with was Rise and Root Farm. So this is a farm that is in the Hudson Valley on black dirt. So black dirt is around up to 90% organic matter, very high. And so this soil has a lot of unique challenges and dynamics with it. So we wanted to see how tarps impacted this. So this farm used tarps for a duration of 3.5 weeks. Muck soil is another word for black dirt. And they planted basil, cilantro, and dill. And they found a significant decrease in weed pressure, even as compared to the local farms here. They found that in their beds that had no tarping, they would have to weed for 2 hours within the first 2 weeks of planting that crop. When they used a tarp for that 3.5 week duration, they had no weeds emerge at all. So some conclusions from this experiment. Tarps can make reduced tillage more viable in organic vegetable systems. Tarps create an ideal soil environment in which to plant by increasing soil moisture, increasing temperature, and creating a planting bed free of weeds. Tarps give a valuable head start to crops over weeds, so even if that season-long impact isn't as impactful from the tarps, at least those first 2 weeks, there are significantly fewer weeds, and that gives any crop, whether it's direct seeded especially or transplanted, a valuable head start over the competitive weeds. We also found that 3 weeks was sufficient time to kill weeds and increase yield. And that gives farmers a lot more flexibility in their cropping plans, rather than having to use a tarp over the entire winter to receive those same benefits. So for acknowledgements, I would like to thank my advisor, Anu, of course, and then Ryan and Brian, who are here, my handy project team who helped me get all of this in the field, as well as our partners at Maine and Long Island, and my student interns over the last 2 years. Any questions?
Haley, first I'd like to commend you for a very well presented seminar, so thank you. I'm wondering about the reconcilability of black plastic with organic methods, and whether black plastic is in fact accepted by the organic farming community.
Yeah, so the question is, how does black plastic work in organic systems, like from a certification standpoint? And that has been a problem, actually. And so until recently, black plastic over winter was not allowed in organic systems, but if it was during the season, it was fine, because plastic mulch is allowed in organic systems. But they said if you leave that tarp on not during the season, so that over winter, it's not organic. But that was changed, what, a couple weeks ago? A month ago, I think, was it? Yeah, so it is actually now certified organic to use a tarp for any duration of any time of the season, especially since you're taking that tarp off the field. You're not just leaving it there for the entire year straight. Yes?
I have a question about the farmer results. Are those self-reported farmer results, or did you analyze the data?
So the question is, for the on-farm trials, did I collect the data or did the farmers? Both, sort of. So I actually had the farmers time themselves for weeding, and that was on them, so they would send me their results. But I did do a lot of farm visits. I took a lot of pictures. I took a lot of observations. So most of the farm trials was qualitative data, except for that weeding time, which I got from the farmers.
Can you see if Geneva has any questions?
Geneva, do you have any questions?
Do we have any questions, y'all?
Yeah, hey, hi Haley. This is Brian Brown with New York State IPM. Great talk. One little comment though, I think you were a little hard on solarization. We've done a couple of demos in Cornell, at Cornell, and then up in Maine, finding some pretty good results and temperatures up into the 120s, killing a lot of weed seeds and potentially some pathogens. Are any of your on-farm growers interested in solarization as well, or is it mostly tarping?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I actually haven't seen solarization on any of the farms that I've been to. And I couldn't find any papers that were actually using solarization in the Northeast. So that's really interesting that it got to temperatures that high. But I haven't seen them on the farms, no. Yes?
Okay, beginning you mentioned that there were farmers putting drip tapes under the plastic. Was this the situation with your fields as well?
So farmers put drip tape under the plastic mulch because the mulch stays on during the growing season when crops are in the soil. So with tarps, these come off before you plant the crop, so you do not need to use drip tape with them.
is there any other interest in using materials that were pervious so water can get through them?
Okay, yeah, so the question is about permeable plastic on top. So that would be something like landscape fabric. And yes, landscape fabric is used by a lot of the farmers. So landscape fabric allows water through. It is also reusable over seasons. Well, landscape fabric, how it's different from tarps is that it does allow for leaching. So it doesn't increase that nitrate. It would also kill weeds a lot more slowly because they are still getting a measure of sunlight. They're still getting water. And weeds can actually break through that as well. So like nutsedge, for example, can break through the landscape fabric, or seeds can land on top of the landscape fabric and sprout from there. So landscape fabric is certainly a very good tool to use, but there are different benefits than tarps.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Thomas. I've got a question for you. You are working with a lot of on-farm trials. What do you see as the best trajectory for the next couple of years in increasing implementation of this technique?
So how do we want to increase implementation? Well, I've been talking at a lot of grower meetings, and a lot of farmers are using this. And so the farmers are telling each other about this, for one. We've been going to conferences like NOFA. We've come out with a tarp fact sheet that we're trying to get out to farmers. I've made a video on YouTube on the Small Farms channel that's explaining to farmers why use a tarp, how to use a tarp. So we're just trying to get this out a lot more to a lot more farmers. And like I said, a ton of farmers are actually using this already. So at NOFA New York, we had a workshop, and 85 farmers came to our workshop, and probably at least 75% of them were already using tarps on their farm. So this is a very well-established practice that we're just learning more about, and we are trying to increase implementation by giving these resources to farmers, and such as like, where do you get a tarp and things like that. Yes.
Hey Lee, what are some scientific questions that need to be addressed that you feel on the next step?
Yeah. So next steps would definitely be to look more into mechanisms behind these things that we found. I would say we need to look into microbial activity under tarps. How is that impacted? Is that why nitrate concentrations increase? More on weed dynamics, certainly, especially looking at individual species and populations, and looking at that fatal germination. So how do tarps actually impact the seed bank? I think those would probably be the most important questions, along with that question of when to apply tillage and amendments, either before or after tarps. Yes?
Just as a performance metric, have you thought about looking at soil bulk density or some indicator of soil structure, which is kind of the poster child for what tillage destroys?
Yes. So the question was, have we looked at bulk density? No. That definitely would be interesting. I'm not sure how tarps would impact that. That's more of a tillage metric, which has been studied in depth, but it is possible that tarps could impact that, but we did not look at that. Yes.
On the lethal germination question, had you found differences between differences in weed populations or prevalence between tilling and then tarping versus just tarping? Because we had found in apples, which is a very different system, that we had more annual weeds when we cultivated versus not.
Yeah, so the question is annuals versus perennial weeds, different species on tilling versus tarping with no tillage. Yes? Okay, yeah, so we definitely did find a big difference in weed species there. So what I found, I did do counts by species when I did the counts. And so what I found there was that in the no-till treatments, there was a huge variety of weeds, a lot of perennials, like you said, and annuals, and just a huge diversity. Whereas in the till plots, it was 90% lamb's quarters and pigweed, and those are annuals. So tillage definitely has the effect of bringing those seeds up and actually increasing the germination of some of those.
And so did you find that there was greater kill of those when tarping after?
We did not tarp after tillage. So that is a practice that's being used, but that is not the practice that we studied. So we actually tilled after. But that would definitely be an interesting question.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.